Please, I'd like to welcome everybody here to the first session of the Australian Roadshow, looking at what happened with the Australian water reforms and how our industry is currently structured. My name is Mark Dougal. I am the Managing Director and founder of Spiker, and we are hosting today's panel, today's session and the Roadshow. Thank you. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. Craig, can you please share? Thank you. In the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to acknowledge our traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to land and water. We pay our respects to elders, past and present, and those who may be present today. Thank you, Craig. So as I said, this is the first session in our roadshow. It's the opening session. And just a couple of housekeeping points to make as we go forward. This will be the same for all the panels or all the sessions we have. Firstly, the session is being recorded. And then that recording will be made available along with the slide pack to all of you. For any questions you have for our panel, please send them through the Q&A function in Zoom, which is at the bottom of your screen. And when you're doing that, select all panelists in the Q&A so we can all see your questions. We'll also be providing written responses to the questions. We're happy for a participant to contact us directly for clarifications or any further information afterwards. We've done some individual sessions with councils we've been asked to, and we're happy to continue that with any of you here today. Please provide us any feedback and input as to what else you would like to see covered by this roadshow. Thank you. So just a couple of rules of engagement. Today, we're going to be talking about the water reform journey in Victoria, in the state of Victoria in Australia. We are aware of what's happening in New Zealand and where you are at the moment with your reforms. So we've taken that, we've used that as context for what we are talking today, but we are talking about the reforms in Victoria. We will endeavour to provide you an unbiased view. As I said, we will be talking about what happened in Victoria. Please align your questions to the topic of this session or module, as opposed to something that's unrelated. As you can see from the program as we go forward, we're going to be talking about the reform journey in Tasmania, governance, the current state of the industry across the various states, stormwater management, the future for water, community engagement, Indigenous engagement, and even council reforms later on. So we've got a number of topics we're going to go through during the roadshow program. So ideally, just for this session, we just keep our questions with respect to what happened in Victoria or what you might have heard us said as you think it's relevant to I suppose, the situation you're facing. Overview and scene setting. Australian water is a complex industry. We have 6 states and 2 territories, and each one has a slightly different model to the other. At the heart of it, though, is the majority of our water businesses are government owned, but there are still some local government owned ones. And when I mean government, I'm talking about state governments. We're going to start today by just giving you a high level context setting for Australia and the Victorian landscape. The Victorian water reforms span about 30 years. Today we're going to be really talking about 15 years of those. The story of what happened in Melbourne during the reforms is different what happened in regional Victoria. We're going to touch on both because we're aware that a number of people here come from regional parts of New Zealand, and we need to ensure that we provide you the right context for that. We will try and tell the best story we can within the constraints of time. The intention is for us to talk for about half an hour, and then we go to some questions. So please post your questions. Thanks. So as I said, there are 6 states and 2 territories in Australia. In Western Australia, Victoria, South Australia, Tasmania, the Northern Territory and the ACT, all water utilities are owned by the state's government. In Queensland and New South Wales, it's a bit of a mixture. Next slide, please. So the Victorian landscape. there are 15 urban water corporations in Victoria. By urban, I mean corporations that provide reticulated water sewage to cities and towns, water and sewage services to cities and towns. As you can see, we are spread out there. Within Melbourne, there are, and can we have a look at Melbourne, please? Sorry, yep, thank you. Within Melbourne, there is one wholesaler called Melbourne Water, which treats water and sewage, and 3 retailers, Yarra Valley Water, Southeast Water, and Great Western Water, that provide retail network services, etc., to communities. We also have 4 rural water services that provide irrigation water to farming communities. Goulburn Murray Water, the one in grey there, is by far the largest in terms of volumes of the 4. Today's panel consists of 3 very experienced former executives that were involved in the Victorian water reforms. The Victorian water reforms happened about in the mid-80s to the mid-90s, primarily the topic we're going to be talking about today. And so we've been fortunate enough to put together this panel of people that were actually involved with it at the time. I'll introduce them. Dennis Kavanagh is a former commissioner of the Essential Services Commission. That's the regulator here in Victoria. He was a member of the Water Resources Department during the restructuring of the Victorian industry. He was also managing director of Southeast Water and member of the inaugural board of Queensland Urban Utilities. Dennis has over 30 years experience in the sector. Russell Cooper is the founding managing director of Southeast Water. He's also the former managing director of Goulburn Murray Water and managing director of Suez Dagramon, and he oversaw operations in both Australia and New Zealand, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. He's also a member of the Ministerial Advisory Panel on Water. Russell also has over 30 years of experience, as does Michael King. So Dr. Michael King is the former Deputy Mayor of Geelong, and he's also the former chair of Barwon Water. So he provides us a unique perspective of being both on the local government side and also on the utility side. He's a member of the Regional Development Australia Committee for the Southwest Coast of Victoria, and he currently sits on several boards. He's an avid cricketer, a cricket fan. Thank you. I will now hand it over to Dennis, who will take us through the first stage of the reforms here in Victoria. Dennis.
Thanks very much, Mark. Thank you for the opportunity to have a chat about what happened in Victoria. I want to focus in on the first stage of the reform program, and that's around about the 1980s to 93. Just looking at the situation around about 1980, we had about 343 separate water and sewerage authorities. Some were independent trusts, some were parts of government authorities, and some were parts of local government, functions of local government. At the time, there's also a Ministry of Water, which was replaced by a department not long into it. That's when I joined the ministry and subsequently department. Some of the issues at the time with the 343 separate entities was that obviously drinking water was a concern across many parts of Victoria. There's a lot of cross-subsidisation going on within authorities. There's a high level of government subsidies, both interest and revenue subsidies, and that was growing. But there's also a very high demand for financial borrowings and grants to sewer townships and also parts of growing areas of existing authorities. Certainly there was a push, it's very interesting, a push by some of the larger independent authorities to try and improve the management quality of the industry. And also I should mention there was a high reliance by the small water authorities on government for technical and financial advice. So round about the early 1980s, Parliament, a bipartisan parliamentary committee was formed of Parliament, and it conducted a study into the Public Bodies Review. As a result of that, it suggested that we needed economies of scale, we needed amalgamations across the industry. And as a result, over the next 12 years, there was a reduction from 343 to 84 bodies. So it took 12 years, but over that time, there was quite a significant 75% reduction. And the ministry and department at the time, they did the business cases and the legal aspects for the changes, and the implementation was actually run by task groups that were formed from the merging authorities. I'll refer to Russell Cooper for the second stage of our reforms.
Thanks, Dennis, and thanks, Mark. If we move to that's right, that's the slide. So as Dennis said, the number of entities had dropped down to about 84 by around 1993. By the time I joined in 1995 as the founding and managing director of South East Water, we were down to even a lower number, I think around about 20. This was at the time when the Jeff Kennett government had been elected, and they'd been elected to make serious changes to the state of finances in Victoria. All of the utility services were state-owned, electricity, gas and water. And the first thing that the new Premier and his government decided to do was to sell electricity and sell gas. And the plan at that stage in 95 was in fact to sell water as well. But in fact, they generated so much money from the sales of electricity and gas, the water sales didn't happen. That became policy not to do so. But at that stage, the entities were fairly inefficient. They lacked the scale back in 1993 to borrow, as I think Dennis just said before. Because Victoria had lost its AAA rating, the Kennett government was keen to do things to improve that, as I said, with the sale of electricity and gas. Water quality was still an issue across the state, and the structure didn't really support the plans for a growing state and the city. So the 13 regional water entities were created, which had the right sort of scale. They'd merged entities together to be able to raise capital and attract appropriate talent. And the converse was happening for Melbourne, because Melbourne was, in fact, at that stage controlled by one entity, which was the combined Melbourne Water, and that was disaggregated into 3 retail entities and a wholesaler. So really we had regional Victoria getting bigger in terms of the entities and central Melbourne going the other way. It was really a search for critical mass, trying to find the right sort of level of mass of the entity to operate. The next slide, please. So the second stage of those reforms happened in a very short space of time, something like 6 months. There was no real state government financial incentive. It all flowed through quite quickly because of the scale of the operations that were created. The Treasury, the Department of Treasury, led the reforms in the metropolitan Victorian area. They really controlled how the businesses in Melbourne were set up, whereas Water Resources, the Department of Water Resources, looked after the reform in regional Victoria, where the businesses were being aggregated together. The regional water authorities had council representation in the board during the transition for a few years after, but that council representation dropped as time went by. The state government appointed the directors to the boards of those water entities, and in the case of the Melbourne businesses, Treasury had a very significant part in making those appointments. Thank you. Now I'll pass it over to our next speaker, please. Thank you.
Good. Thanks very much, Russell and Dennis, and good morning to everybody listening in. I guess my observations come from over a 30-year period. I was first elected as a councillor from 1988 through to 1993, when the first wave of water reforms were happening. And then some 20 years later, I was appointed by the government to act as a chair of Barwon Water. So from a council perspective, back in the late 80s and early 90s, as Russell had said before, I think there was a general consensus from senior leaders at council at the time, and also local government officials, that there needed to be reform. Hence, as Russell said, the 343 authorities came down to 84. And across the state and across the Barwon region as such, There was variable water quality. Water projects at a council level weren't top of mind. Quite often junior engineers were appointed because back in those days, to provide a 24-hour service, there was on-call, and junior engineers tended to get that job. There wasn't a real focus on asset management or capital projects in relation to water projects. And at council at those times, there were many competing interests. So if there was a possibility of an upgrade of a swimming pool, for instance, that got the nod rather than over a sewage treatment plant, or preference over that. And there was starting to get a real concern at the council level about the future liabilities for council, particularly for the capital expenditure projects. So in essence, at that time, I saw Rome burned while Nero fiddled. And then if we fast forward back 20 years to when I came into the water sector as chair of Barwon Water, we're a regional area. Geelong, southwest of Melbourne, has a population of around 250,000 people. The Barwon Water region was over 8,000 square miles, and we had over 400,000 connections. At that time, we had around 1.6 billion in assets that, interestingly enough, had a 40% increase over a 5-year period of new capital projects. It took us up to over 2.5 billion in assets in terms of the size of our water authority at the time. In terms of the benefits, I just really wanted to focus on 3 pillars, if you will. And one was very much around the human capital of the organisation. What I observed is it had really grown in depth. The professionalism of the officers had increased dramatically. There was the IP was captured within the organisations. Good succession plans were put into place, and the industry was able to attract a high level of talent into the water sector. And there was a real focus at all levels on professional development. The second pillar was in relation to the asset capital. My observations was there was very much improved systems. There was certainly better technology outcomes. There was a real focus on specialised asset management and much better efficiencies overall. And the third pillar was a real focus on the financial capital of the organisation. And I guess coming from 343 authorities down to ultimately 15 authorities over a 20-year period led to much better purchasing power for organisations, real economies of scale. Much stronger balance sheets were able to lead to AAA credit rating, and the organisations were able to leverage their balance sheet to borrow at very low interest rates and find projects that very much wouldn't have been funded in smaller towns across our region. So really, in conclusion, I saw in terms of the main benefits that both council and the water industry were able to concentrate on their own areas of expertise and their core business. That led to much better efficiencies and better financial management. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. So, Dennis.
Look, just to wind up this presentation, I thought I'd highlight a couple of issues which I thought that comes to mind over the 15 to 20 year period that we're talking about. Firstly, obviously stage 1, which was up to about 12-year period up to 1993. Obviously, it was a slow progress that we achieved. And unfortunately, I would think that the benefits were still a bit suboptimal. We didn't have those economies of scale that were hoped for. Certainly, there were a lot of improvements, but at the end of stage 1, 12 years of hard effort, we still hadn't quite got there. So I guess that was one of the things that, you know, was a little bit doubtful about the initial stage of reform. Secondly, there were some challenges in respect of staff arrangements. There were transitional arrangements for people to move from the old entities to the new ones, and they were to maintain their existing benefits, not to be worse off, in other words. However, there were some people that moved that were kind of, I'd say, you know, perhaps square pegs in round holes. They struggled, they didn't quite have the skills or perhaps even the culture to go into the new entities. And that was a bit of a challenge, and it did require some further movement of people out of the new organisation. They certainly received redundancy payments, but it was a challenge for some people, and we shouldn't understate that. And thirdly, perhaps more recently, about 10 to 15 years after the second reform, there has been some change in legislation, etc., which has perhaps watered down a little bit of the corporatisation process, where there's been more hands-on from the government in terms of perhaps the government departments, the bureaucrats getting a little bit involved in some of the decisions which previously were left to the entities. And secondly, there are a few appointments to boards which you could say were more political rather than skill-based appointments. And that's certainly been a little bit of a challenge. Although I'll leave it at that at this stage, Mark, and perhaps people might wish to ask questions further.
No problem. Thanks, everybody. Obviously questions are open. Please post them in the Q&A, and we've got some already, so I might begin with that. Maybe the first one for you, Michael. I suppose you provide us a unique perspective, having been both in local government and in the utility as the chair of Barwon Water. Can you please share your thoughts on what you think has worked well and what didn't in the relationship between council and Barwon Water?
Thanks, Mark. I think as I saw the separation, I thought both organisations were able to grow their services and meet new challenges in a direct manner. So by the water sector just concentrating wholly and solely on water, it allowed council to focus on their core business and the water sector to focus on their core business. I think from a Barwon Water perspective, the focus on asset management by Barwon Water allowed it to meet new standards and regulations, and have, off the back of leveraging its balance sheet, was able to invest some world-class water treatment and sewage treatment facilities. I think as council are able to meet its community service obligation with elected councillors, whilst with Barwon Water had a government skill-based industry board. And I think overall, in relation to our particular council, whilst it was an appointed board, we had 7 directors, had a good gender balance, but 3 of the board members in my time, one was a serving councillor at the time, and 2 of the other board members, including myself, had council experience and good links with the council. And we were very cognizant of the fact of having quarterly meetings with the senior management at council in terms of future population growth and be ahead of the curve for development issues. So I think separating the two from my perspective over a 30-year period has worked well. But to Dennis's earlier point, there were some real issues in the early days, integrating systems, and any reform has that, but it's integrating billing systems, new asset management forms. There'll be a real challenge in that in probably, I'd say, a 3 to 5 year time period.
Mm-hmm. I might actually follow up with a related question for you. Maybe you can start on this, Dennis. And this has to do with the fact that the reforms in Victoria span a good, the guts of them, the bulk of them span about 15 years. So I went through a number of stages of amalgamations and, mergers, etc. So can you maybe, all of you please contribute, but I'll start with Dennis, on the pace of reforms, comment on the pace of reforms here in Victoria, and whether in hindsight it might have been approached different, too slow, as opposed to, perhaps in contrast to what Michael just said, maybe a bit too fast in some cases.
Thanks, Mark. Look, I think with hindsight, yes, it would have been great to have progressed more quickly. There wasn't actually a model to look at. They didn't produce a Victoria-wide model, ideal endpoint model at that stage. And I guess they progressed with caution. It was a big task to consult with, 383 bodies and all the board members, councillors, staff that were involved with those 343 bodies. It was a massive task. So I think it was picked out to go on a catchment or sub-catchment basis, the logical groupings together. So I guess they progressed carefully, but, with hindsight, it would have been much better to have jumped a bit more quickly.
Okay, thank you. I'll actually follow up with another question that's just come through. And New Zealand is proposing the formation of 4 entities. And governance structures. So in our opinion, or in your opinion, do you think that's about right? At least initially. So we're talking about an entity with, give or take, about 800,000 to 1 million people in each entity in terms of water users. Maybe Russell, would you like to comment on that?
Well, look, it's an interesting question, Mark. I think one of the issues is really the diversity of the population, where the population spreads to. On the one hand, you want to bring together the critical mass of the new organisation, so it has the ability to employ appropriate skill-based engineers and others to do the work. But you need to sort of counter that with the fact that if people are travelling all over the countryside, big distances to check on equipment or operations, then that can be sometimes a little bit of a problem. Although having said that, with these days, with the advent of telemetry systems and remote monitoring and cameras and whatsoever, you can do a lot of control by remote situations. So it sounds like it's the right order of magnitude. I couldn't really comment whether either 3 would be better or 5 would be better, but of that order of magnitude would seem to be reasonable to me. What do the others think?
I think from my perspective, I like a 2-stepped process. As long as over the 4 authorities that they have similar systems, so you can look perhaps 10 years down the track, and then at that time, if it felt 4 should be 2, that the systems that you integrate are seamless. So I think 800 to about 1 million is not a bad size to start with.
Thanks. Dennis?
I can't add more to that. Thanks, Mark.
No worries, thank you. There's another question about governance that's come through now, just for the people listening, and we will be covering governance in a little bit more detail at one of the later sessions, but I do want to raise, because I think it's a good one, relevant to what we've been talking about. And the question is that we said that the majority of water entities are owned by the state in Victoria, which within Victoria, they all are owned by the state. Can we describe what ownership means here? And what are the obligations involved there? And what's the level of governance granted by that ownership? So firstly, maybe I'll give it to you first, Dennis. Can you just describe the ownership structure? The state government owns everything, correct?
Yes, they do. They do. Yes, that was part of the process. The assets and liabilities from the former authorities were transferred to the entity, and they own the entity. And they were transferred at book value, might I add. So there was an net equity in the business. I don't think their shareholdings are right across the board. I think there's statutory authority equity totals. Russell could probably confirm that, I think.
Look, I'm not sure I can add a great deal to that side, really. I think I might pass on this.
Okay.
Right.
Do you have anything to add, Michael?
No.
No. Okay. Well, what we'll do with that question too, we'll come back to it in the governance section a little bit more and answer that in more detail there. To that point, a simple question is that the state government buy the assets of the council?
I'll take that. No, they didn't. They transferred the assets at book value, and they transferred the liabilities at book value. It was obviously an exercise to separate out some of those figures, but after that process, there was a schedule prepared, and that scheduled the assets and liabilities that transferred under a statute.
Thank you, Dennis. Just bear with me. Maybe I'll pose a question about engagement to all of you, and maybe Dennis or Russell, you might open with this. Engagement of communities and stakeholders is important in any reform, in anything we do as a community, and etc. So do you have any suggestions or lessons learned in terms of how we went about engagement with communities and stakeholders during the reform process, the type of meetings we had, the size of engagements, etc. I'll maybe throw it to you first.
I'd be happy to start on that.
Okay, Russell, go ahead.
Yeah. When South East Water was formed from the disaggregation of the former Melbourne Water, we were obliged to set up customer consultation committees, each of the retail water businesses, and we ran advertisements in the local newspaper asking people to put their hands up, and we had quite a reasonable level of response. We formed a committee. We had regular meetings with them. As the MD of that organisation, I wanted to make sure it got off to the right start because it was a little bit of a potentially rocky road we were passing down. So I actually chaired those meetings, and some of the folk who came had come from council backgrounds, some had come from other industry backgrounds, but it was really a way of engaging with the community on a number of different facets to make sure that we were hearing what they were saying and that they were endorsing some of the actions we were starting to take. I think it worked fairly well, but maybe Dennis, you were there at the time as well, so you can perhaps add more to that, I'm sure.
Yeah, perhaps if I can refer back to, say, the initial restructuring and the process there. I know there were, quite a few large public meetings that took place, and I also know that there are a lot of smaller, intimate discussions around board tables and things. Look, I found in that case, when we were trying to restructure the places, the large public meetings tended not to go as well as the small ones. They tended to be captured a little bit by people with particular issues. So some of the really important issues tended to be overlooked. The noise got the attention. There's sometimes a bit of aggro. And in fact, a lot of the kind of decision makers and influential people tended to avoid attending some of those public meetings. Whereas the smaller groups met with they're informed people. They met with ministers, they met with senior bureaucrats, and they were able to get their issues on the table, properly discussed. They were informed people, and that seemed to work a lot better. Not just saying that they all left meetings agreeing to the situation, but it certainly helped the process a lot more. So the experience in Victoria, I think the smaller meetings during that reform process was much better.
I think perhaps to add to that, I guess my observations the early days, it seemed the reform process seemed to be enforced a little bit, and with the value of hindsight, I think it's terribly important in any engagement process to be transparent. To the earlier comment as part of I guess it's on Thursday's meeting around governance, but the enabling legislation ensured a very strong customer consultative committee, to Russell's point, and we took that very seriously, Bowen Water, and got a lot of really good feedback and initiatives coming out of that, as well as through the environmental consultative committee. But I guess if I was, I guess my real major observation, if you're going to engage, don't engage if it's just going to be a listening exercise. You can't be in a set position you can't move from. You just really need to listen to everybody and be transparent. That's the key.
Thank you. So perhaps back to you too, Michael. Do you think the community during the reform process was worried that they were losing their voice, or do you think it actually strengthened that?
The sense I got from the process is the community didn't really seem to care. As long as they got their services that were efficient in a timely manner, it was only when they didn't get their services, from a water perspective. So the observation I took, and I don't know whether the others found this, is I didn't think the community cared that water was going off into a separate entity.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks. We're later on in one of the sessions, we will be talking about the role of the regulator in our industry, but perhaps one of you can just comment on, I suppose, the pricing process, the pricing submission process, and the community engagement involved with that before it goes to the regulator. Dennis, you were in running the regulator.
Thank you, Mark. I was one of the three commissioners for about 6 years on the Essential Services Commission. That was set up, in fact, initially for the energy industry, but certainly picked up a lot more industries, both private and government owned. And it was running, fairly early after the second part of the reform. But look, it's an excellent way to protect the customer. There are very precise guidelines and codes, etc., for water boards to produce their business plans, their pricing plans, which they have to follow those guidelines, which included going to the community obviously through the customer consultation groups and through other stakeholder groups. They had to spell out and go through a disciplined process to argue the case for CapEx and price changes and perhaps price equalisation changes. They went through a proper process before they lodged their submissions with the regulator, and that regulator assessed them, had discussions with them, sometimes had public meetings to discuss those plans, and usually those plans are over a 3 to 5 year period, so that there was a price path, a certainty price path ticked off by the regulator. Although if those plans were really challenged and weren't really acceptable, often it was just a 1 year price path and they had to come back again. So I think it's a very good protection for the customer, and it was a good discipline on the organisations.
Thanks, Dennis.
Mark, could I just add to that from a Bowen Water perspective? I found the regulatory environment protected everybody, and there was an enormous amount of work went into that. But to Dennis's earlier comment, the community were consulted and had meetings without Bowen Water present to ensure they fully understood what that pricing pathway was over a 5 year period. Amount of work it was going through literally the 3rd or 4th degree when you had to face the officers at the Essential Services Commission for really good outcomes, and they really drilled down to incredible levels. So I found surprisingly found that regulatory process benefit everybody.
Thank you. A question that's come up has to do with again, this has to do with engagement, but around the engagement on the Indigenous population in Victoria during the reforms. Again, we are going to be talking about Indigenous engagement in a separate session at a later stage, but has anyone can any of the three of you comment? Was there anything differently done with Indigenous communities during the reform process that you're aware of?
I can't recall any specific, Mark. It may well have occurred, but I just can't recall it.
My sense in the 80s and 90s, there was very little consultation, but much better consultation over the last 10 years. It's still a work in progress, but I'd almost say there was virtually no consultation back in the 80s and early 90s.
Thanks. We will come back to that at a later session, as I said, where we will bring in some people from the Indigenous communities to talk about how they engage with their respective water authorities, etc. Perhaps I'll throw a question back to you, Michael. At the start of the process, there was a review carried out by government where local communities were consulted. How were they consulted? You've already touched on it, but I suppose, do you think, how effective do you think that consultation in Bowen and Geelong itself was?
I think that was effective. There was a lot of people, as there are today, terribly interested in the environment, and there's probably a little bit of mistrust of authorities in general. So we tended to get perhaps more of the activist members of the community involved. We had 12 people on the committee, met 3 times per year. And I guess my observations were a lot of people when they joined, and we tried to have a 3 to 5 year period where there was always turnover of different people. And my observations from when people joined to perhaps when they left, they had a different sense of what the organisation was trying to achieve, and we tried to work hand in hand. So I think there's a lot of scepticism in the early days, but bit by bit, I believe they heard they were being listened to, and some of the projects they were putting forward were being looked at and implemented.
Thanks, Michael. Do we think there's a risk of growing privatisation across the sector in Victoria? Do you think that we're at risk of privatising our water sector?
No, if I could take that one, Mark. I think clearly that was the plan of the Kennett government, as I said some slides back. And that was why they set up the 3 Melbourne retail businesses as so-called corporatised entities. So they were set up as if they were going to be privatised. I can remember for several years we'd be getting letters in from customers saying that we'd been privatised. Of course, that never happened. But because the government had appointed very much skill-based directors to the boards, it was all set up to go that direction. But because there was not the need for the funding that was following the sale of gas and electricity, that was a big step back in terms of going further forward with water privatisations. But I think along the way, the message that was coming in from the public to both sides of Parliament was one of, you can't privatise water, it's sacrosanct, and it must be left in government hands. When you drill into that, there's not a lot of logic in it, because in fact, if you look at some of the projects that have happened around the state for the upgrades of drinking water plants or wastewater treatment plants, they've often been done by the private sector under a boots type scheme, a build, own, operate, transfer type scheme. In a way, it's a form of privatisation, but because it's still under the control of the entity, it doesn't meet that test. So I think the government is quite clear of the view that no, water won't be privatised, but boot schemes here and there are fair to go forward with, as they have been in New Zealand as well. There are boot schemes in New Zealand.
Perhaps you want to expand on that a little bit, because I know you ran sewers when they were doing work.
Yes, and indeed, when I left South East Water in about 2001, I took on the role of managing director of the French company Suez for Australia and New Zealand, and that was one of the many companies that had boot schemes around the country. In particular, in New Zealand, I didn't start, but I inherited 2 projects there. One was the wastewater treatment plant, the Manukau treatment plant at Mengaree in Auckland. We were part of a joint venture upgrading the facility there. And the other one, which is probably more relevant to our discussion today, was at Lower Hutt, which is part of Wellington. So the Lower Hutt Council had commissioned sewers. It was called New Zealand Water Services, was the operating entity, a subsidiary of effectively Suez Australia. And that was really a boot scheme, a build, own, operate, transfer scheme. So in 2003, that was about building, upgrading a significant plant at a place called Seaview on the other side of the harbour in Wellington. And I can recall in about 2003, our customer, which was the Hutt Valley City Council, had decided, I'm not sure what prompted them to do this, they had decided that they should merge their water interests with Wellington Council. So they sort of spun out an operation which covered the water interest of Wellington Council and Hutt Valley Council, which is not dissimilar to what was happening over here at that time. So New Zealand's already gone down that path to some degree, maybe not as much as happened in Australia, but clearly that was happening at that time.
Thanks, Russell. Maybe back to you, Dennis. I think you touched on about, I suppose, more government interference in board appointments and that sort of thing. Do you know what might have triggered that, or what might have also triggered increased legislative interference? I think that's probably more, the question says legislative. I think we're talking more about government interference.
Look, I'm not too sure. I might throw that to Russell, because he was heavily involved at that stage in the government side.
Yes, well, I'd be happy to speak to that, Mark. I mean,
okay.
As I touched on before, when the 3 retailers in Melbourne were set up, they were set up as if they were going to be privatised, and it was all under the control of Treasury. The Department of Treasury had decided how it was going to happen. and they appointed the directors. For example, my chairman at South East Water was a guy called Rick Charlton, who was previously the boss of Shell in Australia. So he had a pretty significant reputation. And all the other directors at that time had similar sorts of high-profile backgrounds, which set the scene well for the fact that privatisation could come along. But then as things went by, and as I said before, privatisation went off the agenda for various reasons, the department started to get more and more involved with the businesses, and Treasury backed away. And then the water department was really more about taking more control of what was happening there. And with the water minister of the day, there was an element of sort of rewarding those that had helped the politicians along the journey. So there were a lot of political appointments that became more and more a case of, don't worry about the person's credentials or what their knowledge fit might be. It was about, is he or she a good fit with what the government of the day wants to do? And you can sort of understand it happening, but from a chief executive standpoint, it was a pretty sad thing, because the skills that we had started off with at South East Water just dissipated. And the people who were coming on the boards were coming there for sometimes quite the wrong reasons. And they couldn't add the value that the previous people could add. You might like to add more to that, Dennis, because you picked up from me. So,
yeah, well, it really happened after my time at South East Water. But the thing that occurred to me, and I was involved with other organisations in the after 2010, there seemed to be a bit of a push in into other organisations for government interference, and certainly affected things like roads and parks and other areas which I had some involvements with. So I think governments or bureaucrats tend to go in waves, and ministers tend to go in waves. I don't think there's any real explanation for some of these things, to be truthful.
Mm-hmm. Michael, you were on the board.
I think the only thing I'd add is, again, depending on the governments of the day on either side, there'll be appointments made, but as long as those people who are appointed bring a strong skill set with them, that's the important thing.
Yeah, again, we're going to talk about this later, but the importance of a skills-based board, having the right balance. It doesn't matter necessarily what might have motivated their appointment. So thank you. Okay, I'll follow up with a question about, let me just think. Oh, sorry, just bear with me. I'll find a question here. Do we have an opinion? The question is, through the reforms, have we found an optimum number of connections? So we've already spoken about maybe how the 4 entities in New Zealand are probably about the right size. Do any of you have a view on what is too small and maybe too big, certainly too small? What could be an optimal number? I mean, Michael, how many connections did you have at Bowen?
We had 400,000.
And South East Water has?
600,000 to 700,000, I think now. Some of the other places, well, I was on the Brisbane board. We had 600,000 there. If you're in a major city or you're covering major cities, I would think 600,000 connections is a pretty good number. And also your systems can certainly handle that kind of number.
I think the other way of measuring it is really not necessarily connections, but actually the people that serve. And I recall, I think Dennis at South East Water, that we were serving something in my time of around about 1.5 million people, probably be closer to.
It's about 1.9 now, Russell. Yeah.
Yeah, so 2 million people. So it's sort of, it's the connection, but also the people that are being served, because that's a function of the volume of water coming in and out, of course. Yeah.
A question about the environment here from Tracy. Firstly, the first part of the question is, who protects the rivers and the wildlife and the environment in the Victorian model?
I think the CMAs have got a fair involvement. The CMAs is the catchment management authorities. So there's, I don't know the exact number, but there's probably something like about 15 catchment management authorities across Victoria. And they're primarily there to look after the rivers, what's coming into the rivers, what's going down the rivers. I'm thinking of my time at Goulburn Murray Water in northern Victoria. To take one river, say take the Goulburn River that flows out of Eildon on its way to the Murray, it flows through a number of towns. One of the biggest towns is Shepparton. So the drinking water for Shepparton is extracted from the Goulburn River as it flows through Shepparton, and it flows on through other towns. So therefore, what goes into the river, particularly agricultural runoff, is paramount in terms of the level of treatment that might be required before the water becomes potable. There's a lot of interest in terms of the laser levelling of paddocks and fields and what have you, to ensure that when the irrigation is applied to those areas, that the water that runs down to the lowest edge of the paddock is actually captured and really reused, as opposed to running back into the streams. Because the nitrates and the phosphorus and all the other things that are applied to lands, you don't really want to have ending up in the rivers. So the CMAs, the catchment management authorities, have a great bearing on that. They also have a fairly strong influence in terms of the level of water flows going down the river, because in the case of Goulburn Murray Water, they release the flows from Eildon to go down the river to serve the needs.
Sorry, Eildon's a large lake in the centre of Victoria.
That's correct, yeah, Lake Eildon. So basically, if too much water is running down the river, you get erosion of the banks, you get all sorts of other environmental problems. So it's a bit of a measured approach to how it's done, and the CMAs are involved with that as well. And of course, stormwater feeds into that as well, because the stormwater is often going back into the same rivers. I mentioned just Goulburn River, but it could be the Campaspe River, it could be the Murray River. Principle's exactly the same.
Thanks, Russell. Go on, Dennis.
The wildlife and things, there's a department that covers that type of protection across the whole state. And there are also parks authorities, Parks Victoria, and some smaller parks authorities also manage the wildlife. And there are marine parks that manage the waterways, the coastline.
So there's an organisation or a department called the Environment Protection Authority. That's what we're talking about, Dennis?
Well, there's a separate authority called the EPA, the Environment Protection Authority, but that's a compliance organisation. The one that actually is setting the policies for wildlife is a department called DELP, Department of Environment, Planning and Lands, I think and Water. So it covers a range of things. Does that answer the question, Mark?
I think it does. Just as a side note on that, having worked with a number of the utilities across Australia, they do get regularly fined and in trouble by the EPA or the Environmental Protection for breaches, particularly sewage overflows and that sort of thing. So they're not protected, from, I suppose, government oversight and government rules and regulations. They do get fined. They do get into trouble if they do the wrong thing.
I think that's exactly right, Mark. And in fact, I had a role on the EPA advisory board, helping to decide what was appropriate sort of undertakings for the authorities that got themselves into trouble. And sometimes it would be the councils getting into trouble, sometimes it was the water authorities. But the EPA was sort of like the regulator, the last resort in terms of that something has been done that's not appropriate. And then there was either a visit to the court or a fine or an undertaking, and that was the part I was involved with, an undertaking to do things differently to prevent reoccurrences of those sorts of problems.
Thank you. Part of this question, and I think we're going to touch on this subject at a later session. We haven't actually put it in, but we've had a number of questions about the Murray-Darling Basin and the Murray-Darling Authority. And the question is the destruction of the Murray-Darling Basin an example of big entities not listening to local communities? I'm not sure whether any of us are really qualified to talk about that
I
and the history. Okay, go on.
I mean, the Murray-Darling body really relates to the waters that are flowing through the rivers in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and into South Australia. So that's what the covers the 4 states effectively. And the problem, if you go back to the the grassroots problem of that authority, is that over the years, too much water has been allocated to different irrigation purposes. So there's been effectively a clawback of irrigation water so that waters can be used for environmental purposes, environmental flows, wetlands at different times, what have you. Every time that happens, there's an element of pain because sometimes irrigators want more water. They certainly don't want to give up their water. And it's a question of balance. And one of the key things in that whole Murray-Darling Basin, which has been going on for probably decades, is to make sure that there's efficient and effective measurement of the waters that's actually being taken. Because there are many cases, and it's still there today, where people are extracting water from rivers through meters that either don't work or don't exist. And if you're trying to control something, if you can't measure what's being taken, you're really not past the first point. I think the surface irrigation is fairly well controlled because that's measured quite well, and the measuring capabilities have been enhanced in a number of ways with flume gates and things like that in place of the old Dethridge wheels systems. But the extractions from rivers are still not as efficient as they should be, and they're not always measured. And if they're not measured, they can't really be controlled. But the problem is, if you take water from one party for another party, there's an instant level of angst. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the real problems, certainly in northern Victoria, other parts as well, is that if you take enough water out of the agricultural system, you effectively then kill off little towns and communities because they don't have the critical number of people to run their businesses in the town, or their tractor repair shops, or the schools or the hospitals, what have you. So it's a whole interwoven conundrum of problems that occur.
Mm-hmm. Thanks,
so it's a very difficult task.
Another question that's come through, and I'll address this in terms of, well, firstly, were there any women involved in the reforms who might like to share with us? And are there any speakers in future panel? I'll address the second part of the question around, are there any women in the future panels? And the answer to that is yes. When we look at, just hang on my screen here, when we look at the current state of the industry in Victoria, we've got Tracy Sletter, who's the current managing director of Barwon Water Talking. We've also got Charmaine Quick, who's the managing director of Murray Goulburn.
No, Goulburn Murray Water.
Sorry, I always get it wrong. Goulburn Murray Water, which is the irrigator that Russell's referred to. We've got Catherine Ferrari, who's going to talk about engagement. She's from Water Corporation WA. Vanessa Kickett, who's going to talk about Indigenous engagement. So we do have a number of women coming up in future panels. Unfortunately, we're talking about a reform that happened 20 to 30 years ago. And I suppose, and you guys can comment, there was not a lot of women involved with it at the time. Am I right in saying that, or?
Look, I'd hazard a comment there. Is that I can recall early in my days at Southeast Water, we had a couple of female directors there. And one of those directors asked the question about, why don't we have more females in the management ranks? It's a fair question to ask. I think my answer at the time, and in fact, I think I was asked the same question at Goulburn Murray Water, if I'm not mistaken. My answer at the time was, when we run advertisements for engineers or planners or whatever the roles might be, we can only interview the best of those that apply. And if there aren't women who apply, we can't employ them. Mm. But what we did do at Southeast Water and also Goulburn Murray Water is we would organise an arrangement of graduate intakes. So we would deliberately go out and hire graduates each year. It was something of the order like about 10 or so per year. And we'd have half of those would be male and half of those would be female. And they would come into the organisation. And the idea was that they would come in, grow through the organisation. They might go off and have a family, but hopefully they'd come back. If they like working for us, they'd come back. And in time, and it wouldn't be years, it might be a decade or two, in time they might move them all the way through to management ranks and what have you. So that was a planned thing that we were actually doing to try and promote females coming into the organisation. In the early days, in fact, if I go back to my university days, I can recall doing some engineering subjects, and there was only one female in a group of about 150 guys. You know, it just wasn't. This is a long time ago, I'm going to say, but it wasn't a chosen profession for female. That's totally changed now, and probably the constitution to be 50-50 or close to.
Yeah, and so obviously the landscape's changed. There are the Australian water, at least the Victorian water industry, has got its number of women in very senior roles, including chairs and MDs, and we will be bringing some of those in. And also, when we talk about the Tasmanian reforms this week, we'll be hearing from Mayor Jan Good, who's the Mayor of Central Coast Shire in Tasmania. She was also involved in the reforms there. So we were actually quite conscious of the fact that our first panel had no women on it. It was just basically due to the history of it in terms of the timing of when this happened. A question from Vince. New Zealand has a policy of harmonizing of pricing. This inevitably means cross-subsidization. Did Victoria introduce any strategies to mitigate cross-subsidization? I think you touched on this, Michael, at one stage in terms of cross-subsidization within council. Do we cross-subsidize water revenue to do other things and vice versa?
I think from our perspective, by being able to leverage our balance sheet, we were able to do a number of projects in perhaps the smaller towns at a level that wouldn't have been able to be done before, and it was probably cross-subsidised from our urban base to our rural base across that pricing platform that we put in place. But I don't know, Dennis, whether you'd want to speak more about that from your past experience in the ESC in particular.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Yeah, there's certainly every authority had their own policy in respect of whether they're going to have differential pricing in their various areas or whether they'd try and get a common pricing. I think generally they try to get a common pricing. What tended to be is that the savings you're able to find with the economies of scale were actually put into the areas that probably needed the extra support. So I'd say that's how it got achieved, through the overall savings that helped it being achieved. And it's a lot easier to have uniform pricing across your organisation where you have a uniform standard of service. A bit different if you've got a different standard of service. In some areas, you can justify different pricing.
Thanks, Dennis. I suppose a question here about ratepayers being consulted. We've already talked about engagement, etc. But obviously, when people were paying for water through the rate bill, and then the water entity was created, and then they had a water bill, and the rates bill would have been adjusted accordingly. What level of consultation and understanding do you think there was with basically ratepayers around understanding what that process was? Were they paying more, paying less, etc.?
I'll have a go at this one, because there's been I've experienced some very difficult situations, because initially, when you did take it off the local government, you ended up with a bit of flack. People didn't understand why they were getting two bills. And we also made the mistake way back in calling sewerage wastewater, and created a lot of flack from people saying, I'm not wasting water, why am I paying for it? So it was just a very, very bad communication. So learn from the mistakes back in the 80s. I think it's a challenge. You've really got to work hard on it. There's no other substitute for it, but it's a real issue when you do separate the bills. Also, the timing can affect it, and often your water charges might be on a different annual basis to your your rates in your local government, and that can be a challenge too. Suddenly, the amount of time covered in your new bill is different to the old bill. Real challenges, no answer, good communication.
Thank you. Any more comments?
I'd make a comment there, Mark, is that I think one of the mistakes that we probably made along the way on our billing was we introduced this concept of a sewage disposal charge, a volumetric sewage disposal charge. Now, the reality is you can measure the water coming into a person's home quite easily with a little 3/4 inch meter, but you can't measure the wastewater going out into the sewage system.
Mm.
The meters would just be too big and way too expensive. So someone dreamed up the idea of having an algorithm that would calculate a percentage of each home on average that would be going down the drain. So you work out the amount that would be used in an average garden, the amount that might be used with your pool top-ups and so on and so forth. And then you'd make an adjustment for seasonal factors whatsoever. And you'd have this algorithm which would say X% of your bill is your volumetric sewage disposal charge. And there were many, many people who challenged that, because you could always say, well, I don't have a garden, or I don't have a pool, or I'm on a small block of land, or I'm not there, or all sorts of reasons. And it was just a nightmare for water authorities to actually handle it. What they were trying to do at the start was admirable. What they were really trying to do is to give people a pricing signal to say, as you put more volume down the sewage pipe, you're creating an extra cost that has to be handled by the water authority. But I just don't think it really worked. I think it was a good idea that was just not worth all of the angst that went with it. I'm not sure where that's got to. I think it's still there. I think my Barwon water bill still has a sewage disposal charge on it. And every now and again, for a bit of fun, I can ring up someone and have a good old go.
Great, thanks. So, well, none of us like getting bills for anything anyway. So, but a question here from Andrew Guthrie. Andrew's asking, on embarking in the reforms in Victoria, there would have been forecasts of expected efficiency gains to be made through the new consolidated entities. From our knowledge, do we know whether these efficiencies had been attained? And maybe how long it took? I know that's maybe a big ask, but
look, I'll have a go. From my personal experience, having worked both in the business cases, and then secondly working within some of those authorities that were restructured back in the 80s, we overachieved in the ones that we dealt with, and I know some others did. So I don't think there was a problem. Some good stuff came out of it. Certainly, one of the areas which I was surprised about was a thing called revenue leakage. That's a term that was put to when, under some of the older authorities we inherited, they weren't picking up all the billing from the metering that they should have been. There were illegal connections, and there were things like that which were hard to pick up unless you had some good systems in place. And when you put those good systems in place, you found out that people were not necessarily paying for what they should be paying. And I think that represented about 4% increase in our revenues without a lot of effort. So some of these good surprises came out. Obviously, there are some CapEx surprises too on the negative side, in terms of some assets that weren't quite what we expected, and the planning of those assets had to be, the renewal of them had to be improved. But overall, I would think we overachieved.
Michael, Russell, anything to add to that? No, that's fine. The industry is profitable in Victoria. I do know that. It does contribute significantly back to state government revenues, believed to the tune of about 400 million a year across Victoria. I think half of that goes and half is retained. So yeah, it's a profitable and industry. So a question here from.
I think, Mark, that warrants a further comment, and that is that because the businesses in Victoria have all effectively reached a critical mass stage, they can actually do their job, use the resources, and actually generate some sort of return at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. I think if you don't have businesses big enough, you can't achieve that goal. So I think it's very much a planned outcome, what you just described.
Yep. Yeah. No. Most definitely. Most definitely. A question here from Wendy. How did you manage to fit the difference between the rural sector, that is between drinking water and stock water, irrigation water, which is used greater than any domestic. So essentially, is how do we manage the difference in terms of providing drinking water and irrigation water, and how is that managed? I think, Russell, you're probably well qualified.
Yeah, look, I'd like to take that one on board. I mean, there's a real difference between supplying water to a residential home in a city, big city or little city, and supplying water for irrigation purposes in a rural environment. One of the first differences that I noticed was I made the transition from one place to the other is that the average residential customer doesn't really think a great deal about the ownership of the water. They just realise they get a bill for what comes through the meter, they pay it, they take it that way. The view in the rural environment is very different because the irrigators, sometimes they're getting bills, especially if they're dairying operations and what have you, using big volumes of water, they're getting bills of the order of $50,000 a year. So there's significant bills. It's a significant part of their P&L actually is the water cost. And they look upon the water that is in Lake Eildon or Lake Hume or other lakes, Epilogue, whatever, a certain amount of that water in there is their water. And there was always the perennial concern about they're getting a bill from Goulburn Murray Water in a time when they're not taking the water, or for their delivery share of water that was not delivered. So why am I getting a bill for something which didn't come? And the answer was you're paying for, it's like the roads arrangement, you're paying for roads to drive your car on. If you choose not to drive your car, well then so be it. But the reality is that the view of water in the rural sector is quite different. The volumetric charge for rural untreated water is much, much lower. It's like 1/100th or sometimes less than that of treated water that comes to a residential area, because of course drinking water that is coming into a residential home has been chlorinated, it's been sometimes filtered, certainly been treated. It's provided in such a way that people can safely drink that water. The water that you feed your stock with in a rural environment, or water your trees, or provide water for general irrigation, doesn't need to be treated, and it comes straight out of the storage. So it's a different product. But as I think I said earlier on, Shepparton, fairly big metropolis, takes water from the Goulburn River, but it goes through a significant treatment plant before it's actually sent out and distributed to the homes there.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope I've answered that question.
Thanks.
I wonder if the question also was referring to entitlements out of reservoirs, because there is an allocation process where entitlements are to townships and there's entitlements to the irrigators, and that's an accounting process that occurs through the department in the bulk allocations. I don't know if Russell wants to add to that.
I think that's an important point, because there's the bulk allocations at the start of the period. But one of the things that Goulburn Murray Water was doing in the time I was in, I think they still do it today, is they actually do a review every 2 weeks about what the water allocation is. And they change it depending on what the supply is. So, for example, if someone had an entitlement to, say, 100 megalitres, at 100% entitlement, they could take that full 100 megalitres. But if the entitlement starts off, or the allocation starts off at the beginning of the year at, say, 10%, then they've got 10 megalitres to take, and that allocation increases usually if the rains come through the course of the year. So it's quite a significant change. The people in a residential situation don't have to worry about any of that, because it all happens, as Dennis says, under the bulk entitlement to the Water Authority. It's all done behind the scenes. But if someone's trading in water, and that's of course what happens in Northern Victoria in a very big way, someone's actually deciding, well, they're not going to do any dairy farming, and from now on they're going to sell their water either permanently or temporarily for that year. They've got a moving feast in terms of how much they've got to sell based on the allocation that's presented from Goulburn Murray Water every 2 weeks. And therein lies a whole lot of governance issues. It's a scene for a whole new story.
Thanks, Russell. We're going to hear more about that from Charmaine Quick when we talk about the current state of the industry and how the irrigation water supply process works here. A question for you, perhaps, Michael, here is, the question came from Leslie. Do residents in the business community accept that they're receiving good value for money for the water and sewage services? Are they getting better quality and better delivery of services? And do you think they believe that they are paying more than they expect, or a fair amount?
I think we'd hear a lot more if they were feeling that they're paying too much. So my answer to that is I feel the sense there they're getting good value for money. We have a process in terms of in terms of those who are finding it difficulty to pay their bill. We had people allocated in the call centre to review all those issues, and that was closely looked at through the ESC and the price regulator. So and again, it was often a question brought up for the customer consultative committee. So my sense is that people perceive good value for money. There's certainly been an increase in the water treatment plants, in the water quality and the asset management. So, yeah, my view, and I don't think it's an unbiased view, is that people perceive they're getting good value for money.
And I think when we talk to the current people in the industry, we'll find out how they manage some of the COVID hardships, because I know there was quite a lot of bill relief and things like that done in the last 18 months, etc. So,
Dennis, did you want to add to that? Or
I just wanted to mention that under the essential services, there's also another body called the Ombudsman, the Energy and Water Ombudsman. So that provides a reference point for any customers who feel they haven't been fairly done by. So you might want to pick that up in that later session, Mark, I think.
Okay, will do. Thanks. So a bit of a follow-up to that one is comes from Sophie, and she says, okay, profit's one thing, and the cost borne by households. But do we believe that the Victorian reforms have delivered social and cultural and environmental well-being to the community? And that's a big question and perhaps fully subjective, but do we think, I suppose, the state overall is better off, not just financially, but socially, culturally, and environmentally as a result of the reforms? So you've stumped us, Sophie.
Look, I'll have a crack at that. I think you can't dismiss the aspect of profit in that answer, because if you have the right critical mass for an organisation that can generate sufficient profitability, that is then able to handle its own capital expenditure needs and to do that efficiently, you've then also got the capacity to do some of those other good things for the environment, for the social situation as well. So I think it's a mixture of all of that. If you have the right critical mass for the organisation, you've got a capacity to take on all of those sorts of things. And I think the other aspect is you need to be close enough. In other words, making an organisation too big means it can sometimes be moved further and further away from the customer base. Maybe if I could just quickly tell an anecdote. I mean, I remember after the very first board meeting at South East Water, we had a little capital project approved, and I went back to the engineer who created it and said, this has now been approved. And the fellow said, well, what happens now? Do we now need to send it to the city to get their approval? And I said, no, we've got an approval. You just get on now and do it. So what he was reflecting on was the former organisation, which was probably a little bit too big. In fact, it was too big. And there was too many levels of check and balance at the very top level that caused things to slow down and become too remote from the customer base. So I think, and the approach we took at South East Water in the early days was to try and communicate to the customers through advertisements in the newspapers that we're doing a project to upgrade the water pipeline in this street, or the wastewater treatment plant in this area, or what have you. Just a sort of a quick snapshot of, here are some CapEx projects happening in your area. Effectively, you're paying for these, so you can sort of see you're getting some value for the money done. And anything to do with wastewater treatment plants really has a big impact on the environment, because it's what goes out in the oceans. And if I can perhaps just take a little bit more time, but one of the very significant projects we had was all along the cliff tops around the Port Phillip Bay. There were treatment plants there and holding tanks and what have you. And if too much volume came through, they would spill, and they would spill down onto the beach, destroying the amenity of the beach and out into the thing, so out into the ocean. So some projects to actually increase the detention time in those areas, and to put in some backup diesel generators in case the electricity failed and so on. So all of that was about improving the environment. But had we not had sufficient, if you like, profit capability to pay for those things, they wouldn't be done because they hadn't been done before.
Can I just add to that briefly, Russell, with an example? And it's really important to have that critical mass and a good cash position. We're able to spend 80 million on a Black Rock ocean outfall. So now, without that cash, wouldn't have been able to do it. It's a world-class environmental effort and recognised through that. So without that strong cash position, we wouldn't have had that strong environmental outcome.
Yeah, good point.
I think on the social side, yes, because there's more customer input now than there used to be. I think socially that's a plus. Culturally, I don't know how to answer that one, Mark.
Look, we'll think a little bit more about it too for the audience and see whether we can add a little bit more in writing to that one. And perhaps it's a good question again to bring to the current MDs, etc., when we talk to them. Perhaps a final question. We've only got a few minutes left, but and I'll direct it at you initially, Michael. And this has to do with engagement. And we know there's a lot of concern in New Zealand about engaging with the communities, involving them in these decisions, etc. So, Michael, was there any pushback from the public at large when the process of 3 water reforms was introduced, say in Geelong, in your area?
No, we'd had a history of in Geelong, which is perhaps a bit different to other areas, is that there was elected board positions in the early days. So, so when some of the water reforms come through, there wasn't perhaps the pushback that might have occurred in other parts of the state. I think perhaps Russell or Dennis may be able to answer that for other parts of the state more pertinently.
No. Okay. Look, I'll wrap it up. There's still a few unanswered questions, and we will answer everything. And please, any more questions you have, we will please send them through via email to us. I suppose as a closing comment from me, before I hand it over to the rest of the panel to make their closing comments, is what we've attempted is to talk about the industry in Victoria here and what's happening and where we got, how we got here from a starting point. The consensus seems to be, and in researching the subject, we've talked to a lot of people that were involved and are in the industry today, is that the state is in a pretty good position as far as water and sewage services is concerned. We still have a bit of work, I think, to probably do with stormwater, but that's a subject for another day. But essentially, we're in a fairly strong position, and we've actually gone through, I think, the worst drought in our history, and we've gotten through it. People have changed their attitude and usage of water. We do have a desalination plant now as a buffer to that. So Victoria is well off at the moment as far as water and sewage services are concerned, how it's delivered, how it's regulated, and what we're paying for them. I'll put it back to the panel now and individually, maybe just to a closing comment. Russell, can you go first, please?
Yes, well, thanks, Mark. I think what you say is exactly right. And I think the desalination plant that's been built at Wonthaggi, which has involvement of my old firm, the Suez Degremont Group, in it, I think it's a great safeguard for the state of Victoria in terms of the volume of water. It was envisaged to be a smaller plant to start with and became much bigger in the process. So we've started off with a bit of an overdone desalination plant, and having worked with the French for a little while, I can see how that happened. They're very good salesmen. They might not be so good on submarines, but they're very good on desalination. So we've got some good insurance for the state going forward. But there's one thing that worries me a great deal around the metropolitan Melbourne area, particularly in the eastern suburbs where I live, We see the councils there over time relinquishing their involvement with building standards and building regulations, and new homes are being built everywhere we see, which are spanning the whole block. In other words, they build from one fence line to the next fence line, and all of the previous permeable land on that block is being paved over or built over. And the drainage systems, the stormwater drainage systems, were never designed for that. So I think we're going to have major problems in metropolitan Melbourne, maybe in other parts of the state as well, as the stormwater runoff goes into pipes that were never designed to take that level of volume. So there'll be more flooding. People will say it's climate change. It's got nothing to do with climate change. It's all to do with overbuilding and lack of control of building regulations. The councils, when you challenge them on something like this, say, well, it's the private sector building regulator provider who covers all this, raise it with them. They're not interested. They're really interested in working for their customer, who is the builder of the day. So I think there's a looming problem that we will have in metropolitan areas, and that's to do with flooding, because of the stormwater facilities are being overtaxed because of excess runoff due to overbuilding on the properties.
Thanks, Russell. I'll keep you a minute each, Dennis and Michael. Dennis, please.
I probably won't need a minute. Look, we are in a much better position than we were when we started this reform. It certainly helped socially, cost-wise, asset-wise. It's certainly a real plus, and I wish New Zealand all the best, whatever direction they take. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Dennis. Michael?
Yep. Thanks. Look, I'd say over a 30-year time period, when I started in council, there was a real concern that the world was going to end when these reforms started. As I look back in my time now in water of recent times, it didn't. I think that the key for me is around the enabling legislation and your session around governance on Thursday. And I guess my only observation is if you have a choice between a compromise and making a harder decision, go for the harder decision, or have medium to long-term effects that will be of real benefit to New Zealand. And good luck to all of you and whatever happens in the weeks and months ahead.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Please, I remind everybody to provide us any feedback and suggestions on the topics you'd like us to cover. And meanwhile, thank you very much for your time. Look forward to seeing you at our next session, and stay safe, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.